Almost exactly 10 years ago, during the last phase of my fieldwork for my PhD, I joined a young man named Shao on a business trip from Lhasa to Kathmandu. I was working on the rapid creation of a Tibetan medicine industry in Tibet, an industry almost exclusively based on medicinal herbs collected from the wild. Much of this materia medica was actually imported from Nepal and South Asia. Shavo was a herb trader with whom I had spent considerable time in his shop in Xining, hanging out. Now, his aging father had given him the task of traveling to Nepal and buy herbs and ship them back to Tibet. It was his first trip as a businessman, and he was quite anxious to live up to the responsibility that he was given. He asked me to join. We took a shared taxi from Lhasa to Shigatse on the brand new road. The taxi driver, a jovial Chinese woman in her 50s, was in a rush. Regardless of the cameras that registered each number plate at several checkpoints to calculate average speed and define a minimum time between each section of the road. We were half an hour early at the second checkpoint, and we were in for trouble. However, the Chinese driver talked her way out of it, and by stating that there was an altitude-sick passenger in the car, me, and that we had a medical emergency. As Shigatse is higher than Lhasa, the story made no sense at all, but the paper truth created on the fly between a Han soldier and a Han taxi driver in the middle of Tibet raised a number of questions that would later become very important for my work. In Shigatse, I witnessed Shavo tour shops in search for the right present for an official from whom he had to obtain papers for his planned import of herbs. Maybe some fruit or some alcohol or some sweets, but which ones? After an hour or so, he settled on sweets and headed for the office. I learned a lot, not just about the actual process of import licenses and batch permits, but also about the social skills needed to faithfully obtain some permits in order to ignore the rest. Later, sharing a cold hotel room, Shavo was brushing up his English on his new mobile phone, anticipating the business talk with Mawari traders that lay ahead of him in Kathmandu. The phone suggested sentences like, "He's attracted to fast cars," or "I could really use a drink right now." The next day, we found onward transport in a tourist jeep evacuating another altitude-sick tourist, a Canadian woman, this time for real. With her, we passed the checkpoints with relative ease, but saw how the Tibetan shared jeeps underwent a kind of scrutiny that was new and frightening. It was just 8 months after the Lhasa riots of 2008, and what we witnessed then foreshadowed in many ways what is going on in Tibet and Xinjiang today. On Tongla Pass, right before the road descends down through the main range of the Himalayas into Nepal, we stopped for worship and group pictures, happy to have the checkpoints behind us. At the border, I helped Chabo count piles of cash at the money changer, an acquaintance from his hometown in eastern Tibet. In Tibetan society's common place of origin in many ways assumes the role of tribe, for example, in Kyrgyzstan, of Uru. It provides some basis of trust in the absence of friendship or kinship. In Kathmandu, Shabo took me to some Eastern Tibetan restaurants and one of the rather dodgy semi-red light bars that were flourishing at that time, catering to Indian Army personnel. As tourists, then we walked the narrow alleyways of Chhatrapati, and where he filmed street life on his video camera he had brought. So, these few days with Shavo on the road were among the most intensive and productive of my entire fieldwork. They led to several questions and insights that would later become important for my general understanding of the topic I was working on. And the days with Shavo were also the beginning of an approach to fieldwork that has ever since been central to my work, be it walking up and down the valleys in Nepal or sharing rides with people on the Pamir Highway. I call this type of inquiry on the move a co-itinerant ethnography. This is no claim to a radically new ethnographic method. What it does is simply give attention and a name to something many of us have been doing all along, willingly or not. To give it a name makes it possible to teach it in courses or to sell it as methodological innovation in funding proposals. Co-itinerant ethnography may not always be feasible, and for many topics it would also make very little sense, I guess. Yet I believe that the term highlights a gap in our methodological toolbox. Traveling has, of course, long been an integral part of the work of ethnography. However, it has typically been seen as a corollary of getting to some remote field location where the actual work would then start. In the old days, ethnographers were expected to stay for a considerable amount of time in a single location until, step by step, the strangeness would vanish and the inner workings of a local community would begin to reveal themselves to the diligent researcher. Going native meant going local. When I studied anthropology, and we all studied anthropology, this erstwhile approach had already been superseded by the idea of multi-sited ethnography, stemming from the insight that the local scale tends to be entangled with wider national and global processes. In an era of global connections, it seemed clear to all of us that focusing on one location would hardly be adequate to understand what was going on. So multi-sited ethnography following people or goods involves even more travel. Yet, strangely enough, the actual shared experience of being on the road still hasn't really received the attention it deserves. In practice, I would argue most of the thousands of multi-sited projects carried out since the 1990s have rather been concerned with multiple sites, like the pins on this map, rather than with the actual terrain that lies between them. But there is more to it, I believe. Each of these approaches, single-sited, multi-sited, co-itinerant, comes along with a particular understanding or conception of the world we seek to understand. Single-sited ethnography resonates with the idea of culture collapsed into place, echoing what Lisa Malky famously called a sedentarist metaphysics. Multi-sited ethnography, coming out of a concern for globalization, conjures up global ethnoscapes, networks, flows, and the like, the bread and butter of much of the work carried out since the 1990s in our field. What then would be the world that resonates with co-itinerant ethnography? Working in the Himalayas, my reflections started with a simple insight, namely that the rugged terrain of high mountains does not, as many scholars have suggested, foster isolation and therefore relatively self-sufficient local communities, and it does not protect lifestyles no longer in existence elsewhere. On the contrary, the Himalayas have a long history of serving as an interface of exchange between the Tibetan highlands and the plains of South Asia. Not sedentary agriculture and pastoralism are the core of life in the mountains, but trade, mobility, and relations to the outside world. What the rugged terrain of mountains does, however, is define where people walk. The gentle valleys, the snow-free paths, they shape mobility as much as the sensitive borders of nation-states. In other words, in the high mountains of Asia, exchange, movement, and ambition usually congregate along certain lines or pathways, as I call them. It's the valleys you see on this map that sort of cut through the Himalayas. I use the term pathways to describe a configuration that is at once geographical and social. A pathway is not just another word for trade route. While trade is often an important dimension of life along a pathway, it is all but one mode of exchange. Life along a pathway is shaped by things, stories, rumors, and people passing through. However, a pathway is neither just another word for flow. While shaped by motion, pathways are also conditioned by terrain, infrastructure, and environmental factors like the climate or the weather. Roads, for example, are often built along old pathways. Thus, rather than simply moving across borders or across borderland spaces, people here repeatedly move along pathways. Rather than moving between nodes in a network, they follow lines. Pondering over pathways, I found a kindred spirit and source of continuing inspiration in Tim Ingold's work. In Against Space and later in his book Lines, Ingold distinguishes between modes of movement, transport and wayfaring. Transport, he argues, is concerned with point-to-point connections in a network, shuttling goods and people from A to B, with flows. Wayfaring, on the other hand, is a mode of movement much more embedded in terrain. A wayfarer, he argues, has to sustain himself both perceptually and materially through an active engagement with the country that opens along his path. This, I believe, is an apt description of the mode of movement I see happening along Himalayan pathways. It is this engagement with a world that opens up along the way that makes pathways more than abstract connections between dots in a network. They are the very sites where much of the social, economic, and also the spiritual life takes place. In this sense, pathways are made and remade by collective, repeated wayfaring, by iteration, or by itinerant iteration, if you will. Co-Itinerant ethnography, then, is the logical methodological approach to study pathways. But what does this focus on mobility and wayfaring mean for our understanding of community and place? Don't we risk losing touch with the reality of people actually dwelling in a particular place? Well, first, it is important to note that Himalayan communities have a long history of mobility. Here, agriculture and pastoralism never guaranteed subsistence. That what made villages in the high mountains nevertheless comparatively prosperous by regional standards was trade. First and foremost, trade in Tibetan salt and Nepali grain, but also trade in all kinds of high-value items, including dyes, wristwatches, Tibetan antelope wool, and tiger skins. So historically, it was not at all uncommon that people from these valleys would spend much of their lives outside their village, on trading missions and moving up and down the valleys with their herds according to the seasons. Being absent from one's place is thus not a new phenomenon stemming from a process of globalization, but rather something inherent in the biographies of many Himalayan men and women. Nevertheless, there is a strong sense of community. However, historically as well as today, this sense of community is neither based on a sedentary life in one locality, nor on a nostalgic imaginary of home fostered in diaspora. It is rather derived from the shared experience of moving between just a handful of places. The stories of these places are so tightly enlaced that I came to think of them as knots. In my work and in conjunction with pathways, the notion of place knots has been a very useful approach to understand the ways in which Himalayan communities relate to the multiple places they inhabit and the work and trouble of keeping them tied together. These place knots typically include a limited number of places, 3, 4, sometimes 5. They are of a different order than what Abadurai describes as ethnoscapes, for example. Before the 1960s, such place knots typically included a village, a seasonal trade mart in Tibet, and rice-growing valleys further south. Today, some places in these knots have lost their relevance, and new ones have been tied in. For example, the neighborhood of Bauda in Kathmandu, or the borough of Queens in New York City. Global Himalayan ventures, I argue, may thus be better understood as a form of expansion of community rather than simply out-migration in search of a better life. Moving out does not necessarily sever the bonds of community, while moving out entails the risk of disentangling one's life from the knot between the places in which community is made. Moving out is also the other way around, the pull that ties the knot. In a certain way, each of the places in a knot enfolds the other places in the knot, materially, emotionally, financially, socially. Now, if places, as Doreen Massey suggests, are collections of stories so far, then in the case at hand, these stories are typically stories of journeys actually made, wayfaring journeys along pathways. If it is these stories that form the threads tied into a place knot. And stories, again in Massey's sense, include not just tales, but also dreams, ambitions, and things, storied things, gifts, commodities, material sediments of former journeys. There would be a lot more to say, of course, about place knots, and in fact, it's the working title of a book I'm currently writing. But suffice to note here that the picture emerging from this rough sketch of place knots and pathways is quite different from the imaginary of remote Himalayan villages, of borderland and cityscapes, of rural-urban migration, and of larger questions of diaspora. It's something rather particular I'm getting at. Therefore, place knots and pathways do not form an all-embracing new understanding of locality, mobility, or community. They may not help much, for example, to understand the plight of fellow Nepali or Central Asian workers in Dubai or Kuala Lumpur or Moscow. Nor do these concepts capture the ambitions of professional Asian elites spread across the globe, or of people forced to migrate. However, in the context of a traditionally mobile Himalayan society, I believe that understanding the process of moving out as a form of expansion of community sheds new light on the questions of migration, borders, and diaspora. Taking the legacies of itinerant trade into account helps us see not just the obvious ruptures and disjunctures roaring through the Himalayas, but also the continuities in the ambitions of those who continue to call the Himalayan valleys and villages in one way or another home. In brief, I argue that pathways and the stories emerging along them are key to understand expanding place knots of translocal Himalayan communities in the making. In this sense, it is the venerable Himalayan business of wayfaring that leads the way to our own, or to my own, co-itinerant business of ethnographic wayfaring. Thank you.